have been derived, but also says it could have taken millions of years to create the world, or billions. I don't subscribe to that. I think when God said it was in a matter of days, it really was. Because we talked about some evidence of a young Earth last week when carbon-14 dating, the technology itself confirms a young Earth. And so people who don't know these things, get confused and think that you somehow have to mate with the evolution theory that's propagated by man. But let's look at some evidence this week. One of the things we want to talk about that's pretty important in evolutionary theory is this notion of millions and millions of years in an ancient Earth, even billions of years in the universe. In their narrative of evolution, they typically say there's somewhere 60 to 70 million years between the last dinosaur, large dinosaur extinction, and the evolutionary beginnings of man. That number varies, 60, sometimes it's 100 million years. It's around 70 million years in various theories. So man and dinosaur in the theory, basic concept of evolution is carried forth in our schools, and these scientists advocate there's a big difference in time between evolution of man, the beginnings of man, and the extinction of the dinosaur. It's one of their tenets. It's very important in their thinking and very important in their logic. So we want to look, is there evidence that disputes this separation by millions of years between man and dinosaurs? If so, what is the evidence? How much evidence is out there that disputes that? Because remember, we're looking at just evidence. Is there evidence that disputes this? Do you have to be a paleontologist to understand the evidence? What is the evidence that man and dinosaurs possibly coexisted? Where is the evidence? How does it exist? Are there other tenets of evolution that are rebutted by this evidence? Yeah, if so, how old is this evidence? What evidence is out there that man and dinosaurs coexisted? If there is, and it's valid evidence, then it rebuts strongly the basic concept taught by evolutionary theorists today. Conventional theories of evolution generally assert that man did not arise in evolution until dinosaurs were all gone. Refuting this theory damages the credibility of the whole evolutionary argument. So you look at this evidence and you decide, did man and dinosaurs coexist? Now, we'll start Dinosaur Valley State Park up in Glen Rose, Texas. They have dinosaur footprints you can look at that were made allegedly millions of years ago, and they're in rock bed, the rock bed bottom of the Paluxy River. They are rock now. They are solidified. They're not mud anymore when they were made, obviously mud, but and I've gotten a lot of information on this out of Dr. Aaron Judkin's book, Evolution and Human Fossil Footprints. He's got an amazing amount of evidence he's compiled. In 1908, the Paluxy River rose, they had a big flood, rose 27 feet. And a lot of things move around when you have huge floods. And you know about floods in Central Texas and up in North Central Texas. They do happen and they're huge, and they move a lot of mud around. When it receded, there were some interesting things to see. Lo and behold, there were 3-toed tracks that could be seen in the mud. A fellow named George Adams, or actually it's not the mud, it's coming out of the mud, it was in limestone bedrock at the bottom of the river. This guy named George Adams discovered them in 1908 after a series of notifications of various people through the years. Finally, a paleontologist from the Museum of Natural History in New York, Roland T. Byrd, came to visit and look at these things. And he came, and he was a legitimate paleontologist of that era, and he said they're dinosaur tracks. They had been named various things up till the 30s when he came. People knew about them. They called them giant turkey tracks and some other strange stuff. But until they had a paleontologist from New York come down right out of the Museum of Natural History and said, yeah, these are dinosaur tracks. And a mining geologist associated with them Clifford Burdick, fella, got involved, and he helped put together the excavation where they excavated along a stretch of these tracks, I think maybe 15 feet long or something, and excavated it and sent it to New York and so there's some tracks from Texas up there at the Museum of Natural History. And by night they were pretty much well discussed. And by 1954, there was an article in National Geographic magazine about these tracks. And they're valid three-toed dinosaur tracks. There are some other tracks of different kinds of dinosaurs. This three-toed animal is thought to be a relative of Tyrannosaurus rex, a meat-eating dinosaur. There are other tracks that have been found since then, we'll talk about, that look like they were maybe the food dinosaur for that three-toed dinosaur. There's a lot of tracks discovered since then. The other things they noticed there were some human footprints, and this guy reported them. This Roland Bird, a paleontologist from New York, said there's some human footprints around this same area, and he acknowledged they looked exactly like human footprints. And but they were big. They were 15 inches long. There are some others that are not so big, but that 15 inches implies a pretty big fella, 7'6" or something in that neighborhood. And they looked at the spacing of the footprints, and that coincided with that length. There were some big humans making those tracks. Since then, over 100 human footprint trails have been identified in that area. As they excavated more of the riverbank and moved some other dirt around, they found more. In fact, there's a pattern I didn't put in this presentation of tons of tracks in all different directions. So it was a busy area back then, and these are. The Palaxy tracks are genuine. And the way you tell they're genuine, they look at the push-up around the toes, and when you when your foot sinks in mud, you of course get a excretion of that mud up around your foot and between your toes, and you can tell that. And when you lift your foot out of that mud, it stays in that impression. And apparently, there was probably a great flood after these tracks were made. Might have been during the Great Flood. And mud gets in there and fills those initial tracks in the limestone mud, and then you have the hardening of the limestone, and then when the mud washes away years later, these tracks are left. That's the way basic fossils were formed. And it's our belief probably most of the fossils were formed during the Great Flood. So the way you tell, now during this, a lot of this happened during the 30s as far as the people from New York coming down, and there are people who dissent on this and say, well, those were fake tracks, but there's too many. And the way you tell a fake is they would go in, and remember these tracks are in stone. They're not in mud. They were made initially in mud, but they are fossilized into stone. So when you get a look at them, they're hard. If you wanted to make fake tracks, and some apparently did make some fake tracks during the 30s to try to sell to outsiders. But the way you tell a fake track's real easy. There's no push-up around the perimeter. It's somebody just carves out the track, and you see a depression in the stone, and it's very easy to detect a fake. So they've done some things to prove these tracks are real, And one of the things that they found, and sure enough, these tracks cross. The human and dinosaur tracks cross. There's some where the humans went in there first, and there's a dinosaur track clearly on top of a human footprint, and there's others the other way, where they might have walked in a dinosaur footprint later. And their tracks crossing, and this is the same area. And what's fascinating about this, we'll get into some, is who found some of these tracks. And they're real. Here's a example. I think you can see at different times the water level in the Paluxy River is low enough where you can get in there and see these tracks in the stone bedrock. And they're in stone. You can see that three-toed formation, and then it's making a track somewhere, and there's another one off to the side over here. There's some more, and so this is just some of them. There are tons of tracks up there. And the paleontologists said, yeah, those are real. Those dinosaurs walking there. What's fascinating is there are human tracks nested in among them all over the place. And they've been finding them through the years. Now, they found some fakes, but what we're going to talk about are the people that found the honest tracks. Here's some more. And some of these, there's a trail that terminates over there, and then there's another trail you see off to the side, to the right. I think the ones to the right are the food dinosaur. They're vegetarian dinosaurs they've identified, as well as these meat-eating ones making these tracks in this area. So it's fascinating to look at this and say, well, okay, but let's see about the human tracks. Where's a human track in with a dinosaur track? Here's one classic one that was discovered they call it the Delk track. And you can see a human footprint. Whoops, I'm off here. Doing the wrong thing here. Okay, there's your dinosaur huge track, and there's this human track here. It's kind of a small human. It made this thing, and it looked like what they did a CT scan of these tracks to check the density, because you should have, if it's not fake, if somebody didn't just carve it out of stone, because these are stone now, there should be different density under each, not just the push-up of the mud, but there's a density differentiation between the compressed area and the part that wasn't compressed. So they did x-rays on these things and CT scans even to look at the density difference. And it all maps out correct. It's hard to argue with these things. They are definitely, there's a different density. And I'll show you in a little bit. Here's one that you can see is a little different. There's a huge track of a dinosaur, and in the middle of it, there's a human footprint. And you can imagine walking in mud, there's no perfect tracks. You know, you just imagine if you've walked in mud or the seashore, as you pull your foot out, it leaves kind of a bruised track. And there's a human footprint that can fit right in there. People done the image showing in this big track that's going the other direction. And there's been some discussion about some of these tracks, but you can imagine the paleontologists that want to assert evolution have really had trouble with these facts. And so they focus on a few that were charlatans trying to fake some and sell them because it was in the 30s and everybody was depressed and poor. So there's a few of those things going on, but most of the people, when we quote names, these are real professionals that dug this stuff up, and there are real tracks. And we need to be careful that we don't throw the baby out with the bathwater and say, well, they're a bunch of fakes. No, they're actually correct. Here's one that I believe this is the guy, Burdick, that was a geologist, and he was assisting the guy, Roland Bird, from the paleontologist from New York, and he found some tracks out in along the side of the river. And here's one of them he found that was very, very large. I think it was like 15. So they sectioned this thing. You can see the saw cut lines. They're going this way back and forth, and then the one down here on the heel. And so they sectioned it to see if there was different depression zones, and looked like, you know, something had been mashed away there. And they sure enough found, here's a section, I think, under some of the toes, and you can see how the mud, the striations in the mud are different, and there's a kind of a collection of mud around that print. And there's another section where they went down, and you can see how the mud sort of made its impression and flowed around the foot. So these are declared, I mean, any honest paleontologist looking at that, yeah, that's real, that's a real print. It's hard for them to admit it, though, because once you admit it, they're all in the same plane, elevation, if you will. So they have to be in the same geologic era. So that gives the evolutionists a lot of trouble. In fact, most of them just deny it. There's one quote we got from Richard Dawkins where he just says, well, there are people made those things up and trying to make money. But he ignores this evidence. It's out there in front, and it's real. And you can't deny, if you're intellectually honest, this stuff is weird if you believe dinosaurs did not live with man. It's hard to reconcile. So there were some fakes done, but you can just judge pretty easily what's fake and what's not. And the Burdick track, he was the geologist guy above, was actually sectioned to examine the features of compression in the mud, which would not appear in a faked carved track. C.L. Burdick found these tracks in the 30s, and he was I think he was a degreed geologist. So these are human tracks mixed with dinosaur tracks. Now, when you go to the Texas State Dinosaur Valley, I think it's Dinosaur Valley State Park that's there, there used to have a thing you could stand on the bank and a kind of a visual binocular type thing that you could look out into the riverbed, and they had aims where you could see some of the tracks. I don't know how it is exactly now. I went there years ago, and then went there just a few years ago to look. But they don't show you any of the human tracks. They don't even talk about it in the museum. There's another museum across the street over there that's been around for a lot of years. It's a creation museum, and it's been funded by different people and supported it. And I went there a few years ago, and it used to be some 20 years ago or something, it was just some trailers parked out there, and they had built them a little museum. Well, went there recently, and it's well built up. It's a nice facility now, brick and mortar, and they have some interesting displays in there. But in the Texas State Museum, they don't discuss, I don't believe, the human footprints. And this is kind of small to read. I'll go through it. There are a lot of footprints. This guy, Aaron Judkins, wrote this book, all over the world, where human footprints are found among these dinosaur footprints, if not on top of them. And here's some of the places. Northern Arizona, near the Moncopie Wash and the Little Colorado River, there's human and dinosaur tracks. And some of them, of the humans, had sandals, some kind of sandal on. In New Mexico, near Alamogordo in the Tularosa Basin, on the shore of what was Lake Otero, there's others, and some of them as long as 22 inches long, human footprints. That's a huge person. And that person had like 5-foot strides around this lake. And in New Mexico, there's a Zapata track, Robledos Mountains with the mud push-up, it's obvious. There are some in what's called the Jaguar Cave in Tennessee. In Utah, there's the famous Meister track, and that's a thing you've probably seen in some of the tracks in literature, where there was a sandal imprint of a human. It's obviously a human sandal, and embedded in it is a trilobite. And those trilobites are supposed to have been extinct long, hundreds of millions of years before men showed up. And so there's a trilobite in there. That's a very famous one that was discovered by I think a rock climber somewhere. They opened up a piece of rock, flipped it over, and there was a human footprint and a trilobite in it. Then there are tracks in Hawaii. These things are all over the world. There's tracks in Hawaii. There's some zones out there that have them. And here's one that will knock your socks off. In Africa, there's some called the Laetoli tracks. And they were actually discovered by Mary Leakey, that is from the famous family, the Leakey family, where they discovered the little monkey called Lucy that was so popular. The Leakeys discovered that. That supposedly a link between humans and chimps, and it was basically just a monkey. But Mary Leakey discovered these tracks in Africa. And they're in these geologic era where you're not supposed to have humans. They're not supposed to be there yet. South Africa, British Columbia, Italy, and European continent, Nicaragua, Australia, found them in Mexico, even found them in Turkmenistan. So these tracks are documented all over the world, and there's a lot of them where men and dinosaurs obviously coexisted. So you can take that for what it's worth, but they're very difficult to dispute, and the paleontologists don't spend a lot of time with them. You'll see them dismissing them. Oh, that's debunked. Oh, that's dismissed. Well, show me how you dismiss that. So that's one of the things that show that dinosaurs and men really did coexist. There are other evidences that perhaps are even more stunning if you want to get into this. Beyond footprints in the same strata of humans and dinosaurs, there is artwork of obvious antiquity that fully confirms the coexistence of men and dinosaurs. You cannot deny it from this artwork. There's artwork where they know about how old from archaeology this artwork is. There's a famous 11th century temple in Cambodia. It has a column carving of a triceratops and they know when that Cambodian temple was built, about 11th century, 1000s, 1000 some odd AD. And it's a very clear carving of a triceratops. If you showed it to your kids, they could name that dinosaur. And it's in a column, carving in Cambodia in a temple there. It's protected by the Cambodian, I assume, Antiquities Authority, and they won't let anybody destroy it, but they found that there. This cave painting is a famous cave painting in a U.S. national park, Natural Bridges National Park, with a very distinctive and unmistakable dinosaur petroglyph, if you will. There's some really fascinating looking Mexican dinosaur pottery where they made out of pottery, clay, and they think it's from, I think these are like, I'm not sure, 500 or 600 AD. I'm not real sure, but some dinosaurs in clay, and they know the age of these things because they know where they found them and what era of history they were created in. So there's some fascinating things that prove that dinosaurs were seen by humans. And there's some 2,000, I think these are about 2,000 years old. We'll just look at them, dinosaur stone. There's some decorative carvings they found in tombs. And I think in Lima, Peru, they found these ancient carvings on stones, polished stones. They carved dinosaurs images from like 2,000 years ago. And they're not, these are not disputed. They're not claimed to be faked. They're archaeological digs find this stuff. And they pretty much know about what era of Earth they lived in because the historical nature of archaeology, they're pretty sure about it. So here's the one in Cambodia, and it's several images on this column of different animals, water buffalo and some serpents and different things. But there's the ridges, the back ridges on, and then there's the plate, the skull plate, the protective plate for this particular dinosaur that we call Triceratops. So somebody saw that. I didn't go carve it, I promise. I was not over there carving that. Somebody carved this thing, and they did about 1100 AD, or no, excuse me, 1050 AD or something in Cambodia. And it's indisputable. You don't come up with an image like that out of just nothingness. You have to have seen that. God created that dinosaur, and that's a strange-looking dinosaur. The fins had a function in their biology, and of course that plate and the horns. I mean, it's very unusual for anybody to create that out of never seeing it. So that's one. Then there's these Mexican pottery images where they just literally created out of clay and fired it, some clay pottery type dinosaurs, and they were found in some other, and don't quote me on this, I think these are from 500 or 600 AD era. And they know where they're from. They know where they're finding these, so they know about when they were made. And here's the one at Natural Bridges National Monument. That to the right is a dinosaur image. Now, if you don't believe me, get a copy of that and ask your children what that is. Not only is that a good dinosaur image for a petroglyph, fascinatingly, well done, whoever did that a couple thousand years ago, whenever they did that. I think these, I'm not sure, I think these are like, I don't know, 700, 800 AD, maybe 1000 AD. They're thought to be in that era of the Indians that lived in this area. Notice that it's anatomically correct in terms of what the tail did. See, for a long time, they didn't know exactly how the tails of dinosaurs work, what they use their tails for. Some of them have massive tails, and they kind of are looking at this and saying, yeah, that's our latest theory of how the tails performed a certain function in the balance and the movement of a dinosaur. And so they got it right. If it was a fake, somebody got it right. But they say if you ask the park rangers what that is, when you take the tour, if you get to see that, they'll tell you it's something besides a dinosaur. Well, we're not sure. A lot of times they'll say, well, we're not real sure what that is. So it's a dinosaur. You know, I get a 3-year-old to tell you what that is. So it's kind of interesting that we see these things. Here is that stone pottery out of Lima, Peru. I believe it's Lima, Peru. And now this is, I like this one, because I call this my Texas dinosaur, cowboy. This is my dinosaur cowboy, okay? This looks like a dude riding a dinosaur. Now this Triceratops, I mean, again, it got all this stuff right, and it got a dude riding it. And it looks like he may be smoking something, but I'm not sure. So this is humorous if you're a person that's in the camp that we think dinosaurs and man coexisted. If you're not in that camp, you have trouble with this. Because I believe this was a I think they think this is a vegetarian dinosaur, and that's why it has all the protective measures and the head plates and stuff to keep for fights and things, to preserve it from the meat eaters. But I don't know if they tame these things or in some ceremony they got going to ride it. But the notion that you might ride a vegetarian dinosaur never occurred to me. But you know, these were not faked. The archaeologists found this stuff. So there's the chain of custody of these kind of things, and they found a lot of them in a lot of different caves. They even found in burial, these are mostly in burial plots, that they dug up the skeletons and the different things that were buried with these people and some of these decorative stone images. They also, I think they have a real nice, I didn't include it, sort of a cloth blanket or something, if you will, and it had some dinosaur, a very decorative dinosaur pattern on it. It was beautiful, beautifully done. Let's see, get my head together here. Now this is one, another dinosaur, and you can see the ridges on the back. And but there's many of these, and there's no explanation for them. As they're in, I think these are 2,000-year-old burial plots, and they dug most of these up. There's others in that era, and they're not made in the modern era. They've got to be old because these tombs were not unearthed till the archaeologists got to them and they start finding all these things. And there is absolutely no explanation for it in the evolutionary narrative. They're not fake. They can claim some of the things, some places are fake, but when you examine them, they're not. There's plenty of real ones. And so the question arises, well then, if they're not fake, obviously not, and they were made by humans, obviously, who can deny that humans did not see dinosaurs? And we don't know logically how to deal with that if you're an evolutionist. They except deny it or not mention it or just say, well, I don't know. I've heard one explanation by evolutionists that said perhaps they came from some organic memory in the human mind about what their ancient ancestors may have seen. But again, that's sort of a strange thing for evolutionists to say because they believe that you don't have any kind of spiritual memory or spirit at all. And they don't believe you have any connection with any kind of ancestral thing at all. So that's a strange argument. But it is difficult for them to deal with this. So took a quote, and here's a very interesting quote I thought I'd share at the end of this little discussion. A quote from an evolutionist, a Dr. Louis Jacobs from SMU, no less, Southern Methodist University, former president of the Society of Vertebrate Paleontology. And he's got in an excerpt from his book there, In Quest of the African Dinosaur, on page 261, he says this: co-occurrence of men and dinosaurs. Such an association would dispel an earth with vast antiquity. The entire history of creation, including the day of rest, could be accommodated in the 7 biblical days of the Genesis myth. Evolution would be vanquished. And that's some statement he made. If you could really prove that dinosaurs and men coexisted, he's saying that you would literally vanquish the evolutionary narrative as they put it forth. That's an interesting statement coming from a professor at SMU, which is, I've mentioned before, if you like watching movies, get a hold of that movie, Expelled, No Intelligence Allowed, movie by Ben Stein. Just if you can rent it or get a copy of it, it's a good movie. He talks to professors and people, ex-professors at various universities about how they are taught to speak about the evolutionary narrative and what is forbidden. And one of the things that's pretty much forbidden is the notion of intelligent design being mentioned or discussed. They're deathly afraid of the notion of intelligent design, which was developed by I think, a professor up in central U.S. He's written several books, and his primary book in the mid-'90s was Darwin's Black Box. I advocate you should get that book and read it, because he goes into the biochemistry of, like a microbiology and biochemistry and the fascinating things that are going on in cells and the fabulously complex things that are going on in cells of all living things. And it's utterly miraculous to read the complexity of what's happening in cells. So people that want to believe in evolution have a difficult time understanding how these complex systems could arise. Highly complex, highly interactive, out of nothingness and out of just with no designer. And that is the big weak spot in evolutionary thinking now, is people finally getting into more understanding of what's going on in the earth and microbiology, particularly in biochemistry, and understanding these things. And the more you understand about that, the more difficult it is for you to accept this as just pure accident. Besides, we can talk about later, violates most of the laws of thermodynamics. Things don't get more complex, they get more disordered. And the theories of thermodynamics demonstrate that, the laws of increasing entropy. So I don't believe this guy's statement, personally. I don't believe he's telling the truth, that if you could show that men and dinosaurs live together, you destroy evolution. I don't believe it. I think they just find, because we've done it. It's been done to the satisfaction of most reasonable judges already, and people just overlook the evidence, just disregard it, call it whatever they want to call it, to dismiss the evidence. So it's a nice statement. I wish it were true, but I don't think it is. I think they'll keep on doing what they do and saying what they want to say. So there's a lesson for today. Thank you.